Hello and welcome to On the Fringe, the podcast for the artist searching for success, respect, or sanity within the wacky world of entertainment. This is a podcast that seeks to hear the stories of folks, many of whom you've probably never heard of, who pour their hearts and souls into their chosen art while existing on the fringe of the mainstream. My name is Dave Farley, and the theme of this podcast is the story of my life. I've been a professional wrestler in Perth, Western Australia for the past 13 years, and it's fair to say that the search for respect for both myself and my art form is an easily relatable topic. Now, I don't want to be drawn into the semantics of whether you consider two grown men in spandex competing in a theatrical grappling match art or not. There'll be another day to explore that topic in plenty more depth. This podcast has come about as I've continually delved into my own mind to ask, what has led me down the path I've travelled in my artistic life? What leads people to choose fringe art forms? What kind of individual chooses professional wrestling over music? What leads someone to burlesque rather than ballroom dancing? Why become a stand-up comedian rather than chase a dream of acting? Is there a personality trait that leads us to the road less travelled? But this isn't just to delve into the world of fringe art forms. What about the folks who chase their dreams despite always being on the fringes of mainstream success? For the local musician who can't seem to break through no matter what? For the actors who can't or choose not to chase the bright lights of Hollywood? What keeps these folks dedicated to their pursuit as the years start to pile up? Throughout my years in pro wrestling, I've had hundreds of interesting conversations with people from a range of artistic backgrounds. Now I'd like to capture some of those conversations as I try to take you inside the mind of the person who endures the struggles that come with staying committed to a pastime that taxes your time, your passion, and sometimes even your bank balance. This podcast is going to start as a monthly offering, but once I get the ball rolling, I'm hoping to get one out every fortnight. When the $1 million sponsor signs on, we'll be going weekly, but until then, please bear with me as I work my way through any teething issues with production or the fact that I might in fact be a terrible interviewer or podcaster. Today's guest is an old friend of mine who has been involved in the entertainment industry in some capacity for the 17 years that I've known him. Starting out at a kids' game show, Lukey Bolland's natural abilities as a terrific public speaker have led him to incredibly diverse roles as a professional wrestling commentator, all the way through to being a member of a breakfast radio team on one of Perth's most listened to radio stations. He's now pursuing his dream as a stand-up comedian and has a show coming up at Fringe World here in Perth. This is my chat with Lukey Bolland. I'm sitting here with old friend of mine, Lukey Bolland. How do we call you these days, Luke? Professional wrestling commentator, comedian?
Either or. I haven't really done the wrestling commentating for a while.
That's true, yeah.
Stepped away from that. Comedian's fine. I guess some people call me that. That's all right.
Just all-round funny guy, really.
Yeah, that's what I'd like it to say on my tombstone, I guess. Several years from now, probably. But, you know, that'd be all right, I guess, yeah.
So, where do we start? I suppose I've known you, we'd be inching up towards 20 years, I suppose. Not quite there, but very close.
Almost half my life.
Yeah. I mean, for me, from the time we met you, just a very affable sort of guy, always the funny guy in the room. What was it that you think led you to performance?
I guess in high school I was never really the sports type. Not the most athletic guy. I enjoyed playing like basketball and things like that, but wasn't very good at it. And so I had to find somewhere else to excel. And at Gosnell Senior High School, for those of you who aren't from the Perth area, a bit of a dodgy high school, I saw my only kind of outlet that wasn't sports was through drama. And the added bonus of that was I was the only male at my school who took drama. So literally in my drama class, it was me and 16 to 20 girls. And who wouldn't be down with that? Like, that was the dream. Yeah. And so I kind of got into performance that way. But it was one of those, you know, from being a kid and having older siblings, I was the youngest. I always kind of had a crowd. And I'd like to play to them and try and hold their attention. And so I just always tried to be funny.
Yep.
Yeah.
4 kids in your family?
Yeah, 2 older brothers and an older sister.
So I suppose there's just a constant fight for attention, really.
Pretty much. That it's like, look at me, and the best way to get attention was to be funny. If you could be funny, then everyone's going to stop and they're going to be like, hey, that guy's doing stuff. Look at him, he's being an idiot. That's how you got the attention.
Yeah. On the Fringe is kind of about people who are struggling and plying away, trying to find some sort of success in their field. You found some mainstream success in your journey, but the two things that you're probably most well known for, where you've grafted for years and years, are both the professional wrestling circuit in Perth and also now in the comedy scene, probably for the last decade. So obviously I'm more familiar with the wrestling, so that's probably where I'll start. What do you think it was that drew you to professional wrestling, just as a kid, as a fan?
I don't know. It's just that whole entertainment. It had everything. It had, what does a kid want? It wants violence. It wants larger-than-life characters. It wants, attitude and a bit of comedy, and that was the total package. This show had everything, and it seemed more real than most of the other shows on TV, and so that would just grab you. I can remember being, 6 years old at a friend's house and WrestleMania 2 came on, and we're like, whoa, is that a cage they're fighting inside of? And it's like, forget the Matchbox cars we're playing with. This is now ruling our evening. Yeah. That's, these young childhood memories that just stick with you. And so as long as I can remember, I've just always watched professional wrestling.
Yeah, I think very much the same for myself, although WrestleMania 5 was the first one I saw. But I remember having arguments with my brother when I was younger, and he would tell me that wrestling was fake, it wasn't real, it was all scripted, and I thought he was insane. The way that you're saying it seemed just that little bit more real than G.I. Joe, a little bit more real than He-Man. That's definitely what drew me in.
See, I just believe my older brothers, though. Like, I remember watching the steel cage match at WrestleMania 2, and it's King Kong Bundy and Hulk Hogan, and King Kong Bundy starts bleeding, and my brother goes, Bobby the Brain Heenan had it in tomato sauce. And I'm like, well, I guess that's how that works. Like, why would my brother make that up? He's got tomato sauce on his face.
He ruined the magic.
Yeah.
But what was it? Obviously, you watched wrestling for a lot of years, growing up watching it with your brothers. There had to be a stage where you changed direction and kind of thought, that's not just something that I enjoy watching, but that's something that I'd like to participate in. When did that switch occur?
I guess it's one of those things that I think my mum always hoped I'd grow out of watching wrestling. She's like, hey, he watched it because he's a kid, he'll grow out of it. And it never kind of happened. But I remember being maybe in late high school, and I think I wrote to the WWE and said, how do I get a job there? I think I could do that. And they wrote back a very polite, you don't come to us, we'll come to you. And I'm like, all right, well, I'll see how that goes then. I guess, I'll figure out how to do that one day. And then, I guess, as I got older, it was kind of you who started saying, we could do this. We could make this happen. And at first I'm like, yeah. And then I think I started training, and we met a wacky dude who started training us. And we started kind of getting our foot in the door of maybe we can make this happen. And then I think one day everyone was kind of practicing, and I was just on the fly commentating what they were doing. And you were like, you're really good at this commentary. Maybe that's something, if we do a show, you should definitely do that. And I remember thinking, wow, what a great compliment. And then leaving and thinking, I think that was his way of telling me I'm a really shitty wrestler and I shouldn't wrestle anymore. But that's kind of the direction it took from them. We did work towards putting a show on, and I just naturally gravitated to the microphone.
For those that don't understand, a wrestling commentator is not like a sports commentator. Although I would say that the parallels have probably shifted over the years as sports has become more like entertainment. Perhaps sports commentators have become a little more like wrestling commentators in that they're trying to help sell the product. They're trying to sell drama, which is obviously the primary role of a wrestling commentator. And I think most people probably don't understand that from outside the wrestling bubble, that a wrestling commentator is as much a part of the action as the wrestlers are. When you watch it at home, they help fill in the blanks. They help feed the story. When we started wrestling in Perth, something that isn't a regular occurrence in wrestling is live commentary at the shows. When you go see the WWE, you don't hear Michael Cole, you don't hear Jim Ross. But at our shows in the beginning, the commentary was live. And did you feel as much a part of the performance as the wrestlers did?
At times. It is weird you mentioned the WWE not doing it, because I remember first show I went to, it really threw me it was odd seeing wrestling with no sound. Like you hear them hitting each other and all, but it's like, oh, no one's talking. This feels like it's missing something that you're so used to seeing it on TV with that added element. So I think it kind of eased the Perth fans and the Australian fans into the local product, that they had that comfort of, this is just like on TV. I've got all the aspects. And so from that point of view, I think my learning curve was steep at the beginning, though. That I think my initial kind of involvement was, I have to be as entertaining as possible. And it was learning along the way not to draw focus away from what was going on in the ring. And that took a little while, because at first I did the first couple shows, or the first show by myself, and then Rick Sanders joined me, and he was playing the role of the heel, the bad guy, and I was the good guy. And so we would bounce off each other, and I would make fun of him a lot and have shots at him. And I was trying to get the laugh from the audience, and it took me a while to realize, I'm drawing focus off the guys beating the hell out of each other here. I probably need to scale that back a little. It did take a few years for that to happen, but eventually I learned my place. But that was me. My initial instinct is just, all right, so they're doing their thing, I'll do my thing. And it took me a while to combine the two, to go, all right, so I'm really here to really emphasize and enhance what they're doing, rather than just be as entertaining as possible and get the laugh. So that was the learning curve from doing it.
Is it hard to take that backward step when the performance itself isn't actually drawing you in, and you can feel that it's not drawing the audience in?
Really hard. I can remember times where I was just watching, and Rick and I would kind of cover the mics and be, this is awful. And we're wanting to just have a chat about what we've been watching on TV, because there's just nothing interesting happening in front of us. Or something just really awkward. You're watching it and you want to comment going, wow, that was bad. That was the worst thing I've seen in quite a... But you have to, you don't want to bury the guy. So you're trying to still be like, oh, it was a good attempt, and you don't want to make people look bad, but it's tough to keep talking about what's going on when, as you said, what's going on isn't necessarily great. That there is that temptation of, we can just talk about what's coming up, because nobody's interested in what's happening now. Let's talk about the main event and just completely shit over these two guys in the ring right now. So you had to restrain almost and be like, no, we got to try and make the best out of a bad situation and try and talk these guys up as much as possible and hope it ends soon. Yep.
No, it must feel like the elephant in the room sometimes, I imagine.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there was only a couple times where people came up to me after the show and would say, steady on, mate. What's going on? And you'd be like, really? You don't think it was bad? And they'd be like, but still, harsh.
Yeah, no, tough position. Now, while you were doing the wrestling, you also got your start in radio at the same time, if I'm not mistaken. So first, starting behind the scenes, doing production. Oh, you could probably tell the story better than I can, but you canvassed work through 92.9, which is, I believe, part of the Oz Stereo Network, one of the bigger radio stations here in Perth. So, probably better you tell the story.
Well, I started out, I was working at Channel 7. I was working for a company called Sudden Star Concept. And I was working on these two kids' game shows, Amazing and Time Masters. And I was the production assistant and a writer on those shows. And the voiceover guy on the show worked at 92.9. And so I kind of saw that as my foot in the door. Because I was one of those people, at high school, I didn't have that drive of, I'm going to be a doctor. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And so I met this guy and went, radio, that sounds like it's going to be fun. And so I started doing work experience with him. So I'd go in and he was working the nighttime show, the Hot 30, and I'd just answer the phones for free for him and do stuff like that. And then he introduced me to the boss there, and I'd made a pretty good impression and eventually bugged him until they gave me a job. And I was doing really terrible, I think 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. working in production at night, just doing the cleanup crap nobody wanted to do. They'd just leave it for me. And so I was getting paid 2 hours a day, but I was working about 6 or 7 hours. So I'd work until about 2 a.m., but getting no money for it, pretty much.
Yep.
Just doing it out of passion. And then from there, moved into production, working behind the scenes, putting together, the commercials and the station promos. And then got put into the breakfast show doing paneling for them, which is just turning their microphones on, playing the music. And while I was working on the breakfast show, this was, Zara, Troy, and Bernie on 92.9, and I started suggesting jokes for them, and they went, hey, you're pretty funny, why don't you be our writer? And so then became the writer for the breakfast show. And I don't want to, as in, I wrote everything they said, but I helped writing out jokes for them. So I'd be in the studio holding up lines if I thought of them, or after the show, we'd sit around and brainstorm and script stuff up. And so from there, I remember that the reason I got onto the air, though, was I just went to the program director, who's kind of the big boss in charge of the station, and just said, I want to do a show. I'm doing so much work for you behind the scenes. What's the worst rating shift on the station? Just give it to me. I'll do that. And so he said, give me a demo first. So I recorded an hour-long demo for a show that I called Lukey Live. And I took it to him, and he listened, and he went, it's good, but it's not quite there. Record me another one. And he made me record an entire show, like not just talk breaks, but I had to put all the music in and everything, because he liked to drive around and listen as if it was live.
Right.
And so I ended up making up over 20 demos for him to listen to, each one getting a little bit better. And then eventually he went, okay, 10 p.m. Thursday.
Had you given up hope prior to that?
Not really, because I was still working there every day, and he wasn't saying no. He was just saying, try doing this, try doing that. So it was never a no, and as long as it wasn't a no, I'm like, I'm getting closer. So it was weeks, but then eventually I got 10 p.m. till 11 p.m. Thursday, and they basically just said, do what you want. And so I would literally do whatever I wanted. And I had an hour of radio, and it was called Lukey Live, but I would pre-record it on the weekend most of the time, because then I could I had this production background now, so I could produce this show to make it sound really good. And it was one of those ones that I just had fun with it. Like, what do I think's funny? That's what I'm going to put on the air. And then I remember it was going for quite a while, and one of the sales guys came up and started congratulating me. And I'm like, oh, have you heard it? He goes, no. I'm like, then why are you congratulating me? He said, the ratings are really good.
Yep.
And the ratings for this show were more than Nova, 96 FM and 94.5 combined. This show, there was a spike in the ratings at, 10 p.m. on a Thursday night. It would fly up and people were just listening. And so it kind of went from there, and then they put me on other shows. They put me on the Saturday morning breakfast show from there and said, okay, we'll give you a shot in this time slot. Although there was a story with that to get the Saturday morning, I had this competition they called Funny Buggers. And they went out and they just found, and it wasn't like comedians even, it was just random people who went, here's a funny bugger we met at a coffee shop, and we put him on the air. And I went into the PD, and I don't know if it was lack of sleep because I was working on the breakfast show and really tired, but I just yelled at him. And I said, what the fuck is going on? You're putting someone you met at a fucking coffee shop on the air. I'm busting my ass off getting big ratings. You're not giving me a chance?
Yep.
And so yelled, and then he didn't say anything back. I just walked outside the door, and I'm like, oh shit, I'm going to get fired. I should not yell at my boss like that. And so the next day, he was like, you calm down? I went, yeah. And he goes, you start next Saturday on breakfast. I'm like, cool, that worked. and so I got put on the Saturday morning breakfast show, and then that led to filling in for the breakfast team, which led to me getting put full-time on the drive show, which led to full-time on the breakfast show. So it was a weird progression of events from not having any training or anything, and just working my way up behind the scenes and just being in the right place at the right time.
You've kind of brushed over that a little bit, but that jump from that 10 to 11 slot down to drive and then again to breakfast, which obviously is the most important shift at the radio station, that's a pretty significant leap.
It was huge. And at the time, the breakfast show had over 400,000 unique listeners every day. So almost 500,000 people were listening to the show. And I don't mean listening for the entire show, but they would tune in for snippets of it. There'd be over 400,000 people. And so it was a big deal. And I think someone told me at the time that in the history books, I am the youngest breakfast announcer in the history of Perth radio.
And how old were you at the time?
I would have been about 24 when I was put full-time onto breakfast. About 23, 24, around that ballpark.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was, I probably didn't realize how big at the time or appreciate, because I was kind of a cocky young kid, and And so it just kind of like was the natural progression of, yeah, of course that'd happen. You know, I got the drive show. Next thing is you get the breakfast show. Not realizing how many people, you know, bust their humps their whole life and never get that opportunity or get that big break.
You think the opportunities will just keep coming as the years go on.
Yeah, you do. You go, oh, you know, and then I guess next I'll be over in Sydney doing breakfast. That's how this works. That's life, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
It's like those child actors that you see that become all washed up. And they're like, I can't believe I spent all $12 million, but, you know, surely another paycheck's coming soon. That's probably not that bad. But, it was that weird thinking of, I don't know any different to this, so this will just keep happening. Things like this happen.
What were the creative restraints like moving from a show where you're on at 10 p.m. and... I know from talking to friends and just from hearing buzz from people that I know, like the main thing that impressed about Lukey Live was just it was completely different to anything else that was on commercial radio at the time. It was very unique. Then moving to Drive and to Breakfast, where I imagine you're drawing a lot more attention from your station director.
It was weird because doing a late night show, it was the most popular thing I ever did, and I would get so many emails and so many phone calls. And funnily enough, like it's been probably 10 years since I finished up doing Lukey Live, and I still get more compliments for that than for the Drive show or the Breakfast show. Because it was one of those things that there were so many uni students and high school students that would kind of, while they were studying, have it on, and that was something I looked forward to. And I just got to do whatever I wanted, and I had just segments like, because it was just me, I'd come up with ideas where I'd call up friends and I'd just go, here's your script, I've emailed it through. And so I'd have friends playing characters. I didn't have anyone else on with me, so I created a robot that was my sidekick that I would like punch letters into the keyboard and the robot voice would speak. And so I had someone I could have a rapport with.
Sure.
And then there was the character that I think you came up with it initially, which was Westpac the polite
I wasn't
rapper.
sure if I was going to bring this up or not.
Yeah, but it was something that you used to do, and we just messed about with it ourselves, and we do the polite rapper that it was like if you know Eminem or Tupac was PC, and so I did that character on there. And so I just do all this stuff that was really off the wall, and people really responded well. And because of that good response, they go, okay, now we're going to put you on Saturday Breakfast. And then they slowly close down, but you can't do this, you can't do that. And sure. So Saturday Breakfast was still, I got to do some wacky stuff. I'd do characters on the phone and you know, still have fun with it. But then you go to Drive, and then there's a few more restraints. You can't do those characters because, you know, that's offensive, or that might be offensive to someone. And then by the time you get to Breakfast, they're just flat out saying, you will say this tomorrow, you will not say this. And it gets to the point where you say, okay, so you hired me because I'm funny and I've got all these great creative ideas, but you don't want me to be funny or use any of my great creative ideas. And so you wind up having someone who is a failed radio announcer telling you what you should and shouldn't do. And it gets to the point where you say, well, you weren't good enough to make it, so why are you now good enough to tell me what to do?
What do you think that is? Is that just they know the ear of an advertiser, or do they really think that they're the creative type? It's
a little bit that they think they're creative type, but it's also that they want to be able to have that, this was my idea. So when they go back to their big boss, and Southern Cross Austereo is a huge company, so they want to get out of Perth. They want to get back over east. And so to do that, they want to have success and they want to be able to claim credit. And so they want to go back to their boss and go, yep, that whole thing was my idea. And so that's what they kind of do to you. But I had like literally a boss once. He pulled me up and said, I called someone a knob on the air, and he raked me over the coals and pulled me in and was yelling at me. And he said, you can't use language like that on the air. And said, it's not like I said the C word. And he looked at me, shook his finger, and he said, you may as well have. Like it's the same thing calling someone a knob as to saying, yeah. And it was that ridiculous that I remember I got on the air in the next break and jumped on and said, so I'm talking about my girlfriend's friend who's a bit of a knob. Sorry, can't say knob. Have to say something else. So he's a bit of a dickhead. And so he's pulled me up at the end of the shift and he's like, what the hell was that, mate? And I'm like, well, you said I couldn't say knob. And he goes, you know that's worse. Didn't go well. But there is that problem of, yeah, they put those restraints. You can't do this, you can't do that. And so this show, like Lukey Live, that everyone was such a big fan of, by the time you get to breakfast, what you're doing doesn't even resemble this show that people liked and admired. And so it's a bit disappointing that you kind of, the ratings come in, and our ratings were pretty solid. But you just think, if I was able to do what I wanted, I guarantee you these would be better, because people want to hear something different. They don't want to hear that same formula of, okay, we got two guys and a girl, you know what you have to do, you say something kind of sexist and she'll beat you down in place.
Was there something in radio that, especially when you were doing Lukey Live, was there something you were aiming towards that you had heard previously? Was there something that inspired you in terms of radio, or was it more just a sense of comedy?
There was a couple shows that I watched, like Saturday Night Live was a big one. And I always loved the Weekend Update segment. And so I would try and do my own version of that each week. So I'd have a mini Weekend Update. And there was another show on American TV called Dennis Miller Live. And Dennis Miller was a great comedian who used to be on Saturday Night Live, who became this horrible political jerk-off. But he used to be a really good comedian, and so he had a show called Dennis Miller Live, so I kind of tried to base a lot of it around that here's something I find funny, I'll try and create something in that same theme that I think people would enjoy, that there's nothing like in Perth. So it wasn't so much radio, but it was more just, here's some comedy stuff I enjoy, let's do things like that.
Yeah, sure. And starting out with Bernie Britton,
yes,
who both you would have been on the show with Zara, Troy, and Bernie when you were writing and producing, and then later you would co-host with Bernie. Bernie was a staple of the Perth breakfast radio scene. I'm sure many people in Perth still recognise that name immediately. What was it like working with Bernie, and how much did he help with your development?
Bernie, he was originally with Gary, Jane, and Bernie. So he was back with, Gary Shannon, then with Zara, Troy, and Bernie, and then, it was the Larry Baxter show with Bernie, Luke, and Sal. And
just touching on that,
yeah,
the Larry Baxter show, I remember you telling me at the time that whoever thought of the idea, whoever thought of the concept, just thought that people would be intrigued by, well, who is Larry Baxter?
Yeah.
We've never heard of this guy. I don't recall this ever having been done since or prior.
Yeah, there's a reason it hasn't been done since. It was a
terrible
shit idea.
Yeah.
But they built it up like this whole, they said, it's like Charlie's Angels. You never really see Charlie. And I'm like, Charlie's Angels, I never even saw that show. Like, that was on before my time. The movies came later, which I knew, but it seemed like a bad idea. But they'd gone through a couple of advertising agencies who'd come up with different pitches for them to use for the show. And the other was The Gist, with Bernie, Luke, and Sal, was one of the ideas. And the one I wanted to go with was Bernie, Luke, and Sal, I thought was good, because that would really get our names across, and not a fictional character's name followed by some names you may remember.
As stupid as that sounds, that's just a staple of... if you look right across breakfast radio in Perth,
yeah,
I think every single radio station would have just the names of the presenters.
Pretty much, and there's a reason for that. You want people to remember the names of the presenters, not a fictional character.
Yeah.
And so, that was the name they came up with, and it didn't really work, but we were kind of stuck with it from that point. But yeah, Bernie was and is the funniest person I've ever met. And he doesn't have an off switch. Bernie is always on, and it is exhausting to be around him sometimes because you try and keep up and it's not really possible. But it helped me be a better performer on air because I had to compete with the best. And so it makes you lift your game, and you're really coming out swinging and trying to do the best you can. And he was an awesome guy to work with, and he was a real champion of mine because I would write stuff for his show beforehand, so he would go to then the bosses when Zara and Troy were leaving and say, this is the guy we should get. He's really funny, and he would go to bat for me. And I don't think I would have got the show had he not been in their ears building me up and singing my praises.
Yep.
So he was an awesome guy to work with. And, he's one of those people that we never really had disagreements, which is tough when you're locked in a room with someone for 5 or 6 hours a day,
Especially when you're waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning to start your shift.
It's tough, but we always got along really well. And even now, it's been a long time. It's been 8 or 9 years since we did the show, and I don't think a day goes by where we don't email each other and check in. He lives in Los Angeles now with his wife, but we still every day check in with each other. Still incredibly close friends, and he was instrumental in getting me onto the breakfast show. Absolutely.
And I don't know if you want to go into the actual story or not, but what was it like leaving 92.9 and returning to just a regular day job, going from this radio show where you're in the limelight within the Perth radio scene, and then all of a sudden you've got to return to a regular job, a 9 to 5?
It was incredibly difficult. I remember I did a contract negotiation with the radio station, and I've been doing breakfast show for about a year and a half at this stage, and all year I wasn't getting paid a lot. I think I was getting paid about $60,000 a year, which when you're doing a breakfast show being listened to by 400,000 people, it's not a lot of money. And I knew that, what other people were roughly on. So I remember going in and I had my contract negotiation with the general manager at the time, and all year they've been telling me, this is your year to prove yourself. Next year, that's your money year. So you do well this year, you get a huge bump, and that's going to be your big year.
Dangling the carrot.
Yeah. And so I'd done all these ridiculous things that had been asked of me, and I'd worked my butt off all year. And so it gets through to this contract negotiation, and she's put a contract, has been sent out to me, and it's for $63,000. So that's the big bump they've been promising.
Not the carrot you were looking for.
No. And so I went back in, and I'm really kind of angry that they've lowballed me. And so I've sat down for this contract negotiation with the general manager, and she's gone, oh, that's a typo on the contract. And I'm like, oh, thank goodness. This is going to be a much better negotiation. And she's crossed out the 3 and written a 5, so made it 65,000. And I have basically laughed at that and said, this is not what I've been promised. When I was waking up at 2:30 every morning, and when I was introducing a movie premiere every other night and doing these listener parties, and I've been working 15, 16-hour days most days.
Trying to build the show, build your own profile.
And so I was kind of insulted, and I've said, look, I think I should get this much, and I've written down 100,000, which I didn't want to get. This is how negotiation works. If they'd have said that, I would have been happy. But she's gone, you don't expect us to pay that. And I went, no, I expect you to counteroffer. That's how negotiations work. And she's gone, okay, well, I'll have a think about it. And basically called back later that day and just said, well, we've decided not to accept your counteroffer, and so good luck. And I just sat there and it was devastating that there was that's not how a negotiation works. I didn't get a chance to, and so I was...
So even in that moment, I know a lot of people just would have been angry and probably would have bitten back, but you're kind of able to grasp exactly what's going on.
Yeah, I remember I sent back an email that day, and I was living with you at the time.
Yep.
And I sat down on my computer and I typed out and just said, I'm really disappointed that you've decided to do this. That's been my home for 8 years, and I'd hoped that it would continue on that way. I'm really disappointed it came to this. So I kind of kept a pretty level head for the most part. But it was really hard, and the worst part was that at the end of the breakfast show, I just started getting into doing lots of crazy calls, they called them.
Yep.
And so now I got to find another job. So I'm calling up potential employers, and they're like, yeah, good try, Lucky. Recognize that voice. Not going to get me. And I'm like, no, really, I need a job.
I need work, please.
And so it was really tough to go from that, and especially since my next job was working in kind of customer service. And so having so many people recognize you, because we'd had a lot of TV commercials and bus shelter ads and all this stuff. So people recognize you everywhere you go. So having every second person go, so why aren't you on the radio anymore? And you'd be like, here we go again.
Just a constant reminder.
Yeah, so it was a tough few years afterwards from that, really tough. But that's kind of where I then started doing the stand-up comedy. So it's like I'm not getting to use that creative part of my brain anymore. Before it erodes, I want to do something. And I'd done one lot of stand-up while I was on The Breakfast Show. They had a competition with FHM. They were searching for the funniest man in Australia. And so my producer at the time, Clint, on The Breakfast Show, signed me up to do this thing. And I did my first lot of stand-up. And I was competing against people who'd been doing it for 5 or 6 years who were much better than me.
Yep.
But I did pretty well for my first time. I think my main joke at the time was... I was talking about easy jobs. And I said, like, the guy who designed the Japanese flag, you can't tell me that guy was putting in 12-hour days. He was just walking through a shopping centre and went, red dot, that's it, Japan, the price choppers. And so that got a really big laugh, and they put it on the FHM DVD of the best bits of the whole national search.
Yep.
And so I kind of had a bit of... I'd done one set. And so the next year I went back and I went, I'm pretty good at this. Made the best of DVD on my first try. And so entered Raw Comedy and got up and ate a giant bag of shit on stage. I think I got up and I was trying to impress friends in the crowd. And one of my friends there was like, you know who I love? Dave Hughes. And so I think I wound up just doing a really bad Dave Hughes impression to try and impress this person in the crowd. And it did not work. And it was horrible. And so it took a while to get back up again after you die horribly on stage. It's the most awful feeling. And it oddly happens a lot people's second time. That they get this false confidence their first time. They're like, well, I'm awesome at this. Let's do it again. And then suck their second time.
And I mean, there wasn't podcasting or anything like that around the time. So it wasn't like you could have heard other stand-up comedians talking about the experience of how to develop a set or just how to get up and present yourself to a crowd. I suppose you're just going completely off feel and what you'd seen and heard.
Yeah, well, it's literally... I've always been a student of comedy, and I worked, as you said, I don't think we talked about that, but I did work for a video store for a short while, which is where we met.
Yes.
You were coming in renting SummerSlam 95?
Probably.
Yeah, and I remember I started chatting to you about it, and that's how we got to be friends.
I don't want to get into it too much, but I'm pretty sure our relationship is actually built on you wiping the ridiculous amount of fines that I used to rack up at your video store.
That is one of the reasons I got fired from that job. Wiping your fines was a big one that I remember the boss one day just going, how come these $4,000 of fines are now a credit for this customer? And going, no. That and the fact that I accidentally pepper sprayed a customer once because I was 17 and they said, if you ever get robbed, here's a can of pepper spray. And then I was 17. What? Of course I'm going to spray the pepper spray as soon as they leave.
There's no way you're not using that thing.
And so I gave it a generous spray in the air and I instantly start choking. It's just way stronger. So I turn on the fan on the counter, which blows it directly at the door as a customer walks in and starts having an asthma attack. And I can't help because I'm choking to death and I'm wiping tears and the customer's like, what the hell's going on? Like, I got out their Ventolin and they said, what happened? And I said, man, hay fever. It's always worse in August. I don't know what to tell you. So that was another reason why I think I got fired. But wiping your fine's definitely part of that. But while I was working at the video store, I would grab every comedy video. So I worked my way from literally at the A of the comedy, and my goal was to watch every comedy movie while I got free rentals. And so I literally worked through and I watched every comedy movie they had, every stand-up special, every just comedy movie. And, I've always been a big fan of comedy. So that's how I learned, was just watching, that there wasn't really anyone I knew that was a comedian I could talk to. So it was just, okay, that seems to be how you do a joke. I guess I'll do it like that. And there was, several comedians who I connected with, who I didn't try to emulate, but I tried to aspire to be like.
Sure.
Yeah. So that's more or less how the stand-up happened, how I began writing and putting things together. But, it wasn't like there was a mentor or someone who could take me under their wing. It was just, you get up on stage and you try it and you hope that it works.
And much like wrestling was at the time, I don't remember comedy really being that big in Perth at the time. Was it hard finding stage time? Were there many rooms around?
The main one, when I was younger, there was always the Laugh Resort, and that's where I used to go. It used to be at the Brass Monkey. It's now at Rosie O'Grady's Northbridge. Mm-hmm. But there was a couple comedians that I really admired on the Perth scene. One of them being Dave Callan, who now, of course, big star in Australian comedy, went on to do The Rove Show on Channel 9 and Triple J and all that. He was one that if I ever saw his name in Express, I'd be like, well, I'm clearly got to go see that. I was a big fan of his. I was a big fan of... There was a guy named Victimized who... I never got to meet him. He'd finished doing stand-up before I started. But he was one of my favourites to watch. And I remember going along and seeing him, and then he was on the next week, so I went back to watch again. And he apologised to me saying, sorry, the jokes were the same. And I'm like, I love them. It was great seeing him again. I could watch him again next week. But so there was a few people on the local scene who were really good.
Is he still around now?
No.
Just disappeared.
Yeah, I think the problem with Perth comedy is you either advance to another state or another country, or you eventually get tired of it and move on. And that's what seems to be the trend with most people who I've done stand-up with, which is one of the toughest things that I did stand-up for quite a few years, and then I stopped when my first daughter was born. I stopped for a good maybe 4 years. Yeah. And so then coming back in was like starting from scratch in a way that I didn't want to use all my old jokes. I wanted to write new stuff. But most people who were then on the scene weren't around when I was preview. Even just in 4 years, it's a whole turnover that everyone's either moved over to Sydney, Melbourne, or overseas, or has stopped doing it. And so you're walking into the same clubs you've performed at 100 times and you don't recognize anyone. It's a really weird feeling. And it's also weird being the old guy in the room.
Sure.
That, when I first started, I'm in my mid-20s. Now I'm in my, early to mid-30s. And you walk in and there's guys who are 17, 18. And it's weird feeling old backstage when everyone else used to be my age. What the hell happened? And then it's not like they're not funny. Like, these guys are hilarious.
Yep.
And they're younger than me. How do you not feel threatened by that?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, you spoke about the birth of your daughter. You've now got 2 kids. How has becoming a father changed the way you prepare and also the way that you approach your comedy as well? It's
weird because going back and being the older comedian now, I watch all the younger guys and they're doing a lot of jokes about stuff I used to do jokes about, a lot of jokes about dating, and they're talking about stuff that I can't relate to, like Tinder. And I had to get them to show it to me because I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is or how it works. And so, yeah, I find that now I'm doing a lot of stuff about being a new parent. And I'm trying, it's not every joke because you don't want to come out to a pub on a Friday night to hear, yeah, this dude's going to talk about his kids. Oh, let's hope he shows us photos in his wallet. Like, I know people who are drinking don't want to hear that. But a lot of my jokes I do about being a parent because I know there are people who are just like, oh, thank God I got a night away from the kids. And they can relate to that stuff. And that's the audience I need to go for because I can't be talking about Tinder and the stuff that these younger people are. Mm-hmm. So I need to focus on, this is my kind of area, this is my niche now, I can focus on this, and that's my ability to be relatable to a large chunk of the audience that way. But so a lot of the being a parent does change how it doesn't change the joke writing process, but your thought process, you're in a different frame of mind because it's such a big part of your life that Absolutely. When you're thinking of ideas for stand-up bits, that's where your brain naturally goes.
Yep. So you just find yourself naturally leaning towards a more personal style of comedy, whereas maybe when you were younger it was more observational?
Yeah, certainly. I've kind of always had a big thing about relationships. It's been a big driving in my stand-up. So it is weird now that the relationships I'm talking about aren't so much dating, boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, but more kids, family. That's where my brain's taking it. But it's constantly coming up with new material is the toughest thing, because my biggest fear as a stand-up is that you're going to be on stage, you tell a joke, and someone in the audience goes, "Heard that?" You're like, I was at the show 4 weeks ago, I'm going to have to... So I try and constantly come up with new things to talk about. And it's tough sometimes that you know, there's only so many hours in the day.
Obviously, being a new parent myself as well, you find that your life bubble becomes much smaller as a parent, and in turn, obviously, life experience becomes more centered as well. You spend most of your time worrying about your kids, and if you aren't with your kids, you're worrying about them or what they're doing, or thinking about mentally preparing yourself for going back into the fray when it's your turn to go back and look after the kids again. So I imagine it's harder to draw from your life experience when your life experience is becoming more narrow at the same time.
Especially with that. I don't know what your bedtime situation's like, but ours is around 7 p.m. Kids go to bed.
Just about the same.
Yeah, and generally it'll be 7:15 before they're actually you walking out of the room, because they'll come up with a million reasons. I need water. I didn't do this. I didn't. And so it gets pushed back a little. But it finally gets to 7:15, and my wife and I are just like, oh man, I just want to sit on the couch. And most nights, that's the point where I then have to jump in the car and drive out to do stand-up. So I haven't had a lot of time to live my life. I've been waking up at 5 a.m. to go to my day job, to then go race, pick up the kids, make dinner, do the whole bedtime routine, and then go work another job.
Yep.
And so, it's tough to kind of have time to even sit down and write. And the most frustrating thing, I had a thing the other day. I wrote this bit that was doing pretty well. And it was just talking about stupid things that annoy me. Because I'm one of those people that trivial things that really shouldn't affect me just annoy me to no end. And so I had this bit about it. It annoys the hell out of me when people keep Vegemite in the fridge. Simple premise.
It annoys me when people keep Vegemite in general.
Yeah, see, I'm a fan, but it annoys me because, you have Vegemite in the fridge, you've got your warm buttery toast, you put the Vegemite on, and now that cold Vegemite has destroyed my warm buttery toast. And so I came up with a bit where I talked about that, and then I talked about how they make salt-reduced Vegemite now. And I said, that's all Vegemite is. It's yeast, black paint, and salt. You know that if you pour it on or near a snail or slug, it will die.
Yeah.
My grandfather didn't die in World War II, so people could have salt-reduced Vegemite. Literally, he did not die in World War II. He's still alive, still keeping his Vegemite in the pantry like a normal, rational human being. But then I came up, the line I finished it with was, I said, I don't know why you even need to refrigerate Vegemite. Vegemite can't go bad because Vegemite was never fresh to begin with.
Yeah.
And so I was pretty proud and it was doing well. And then one of my friends posted on Facebook, Jerry Seinfeld doing this, how he constructs a joke. And so he's going through the whole process of writing. And the joke he's writing is he's talking about Pop-Tarts. And he gets to the end and he goes, Pop-Tarts, why do they have a use-by date? Pop-Tarts aren't fresh. Pop-Tarts, were never fresh to begin with. And I'm like, oh, now I can never do that joke again. And so there's that frustration of when you finally come up with an idea, there could be a comedian on the other side of the planet who has the exact same joke. That's a completely different subject matter, but essentially it's the same joke. So I'd feel dirty if I'm up there. That even though I know I wrote this joke, there could be someone in the crowd that go, I heard Jerry Seinfeld do that about Pop-Tarts. This guy's not very original. I'm like, what is that pommy guy doing in an Australian crowd? That makes no sense. So
there are a lot of poms in Perth.
It's true. So that constantly coming up with new material and then having stuff like that where it's dashed, or you come up with a joke and then you find out someone's got a really similar bit. I had just an easy joke where I would say, if you like my stand-up, I'll be selling CDs outside in the lobby. I've got some old Ace of Base CDs I'm trying to get rid of. And then I saw another comedian the other night who did the same bit, but he did, I'm selling DVDs afterwards. Picked them up in Bali cheap. And I'm like, it's essentially the same joke. I got to drop mine.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's the toughest with writing, is just having, you don't want to be accused of stealing jokes. And so you have to keep it fresh. And
if you're going to have parallel thinking, though, Jerry Seinfeld's not a bad one to have parallel thinking with.
It's true. He's, I guess, pretty successful at the whole stand-up thing.
He's done okay for himself.
Yeah.
What you were just talking about in terms of parallel thinking on a local level, do you throw the joke away immediately regardless of who the person is? Or is there some sort of hierarchy within comedy?
It's a tough line, because there was one I came up with. I'm writing my show for the Perth Fringe World Festival next year, and I've got a whole bit where I talk about my previous relationships. The whole show revolves around the relationships before I got married. And with my very first girlfriend out of high school, she wasn't a particularly nice person. I'm not going to mention her name, so I can say that. And when I broke up with her, she took it really well, which was a surprise because she was a pretty nasty person. So I'm like, this is going really well, this breakup. And so I kind of said, so that's it. She went, yep, hug me. And I'm like, she even hugged me. This is awesome.
This is as good as a breakup can really go.
And this was my first ever girlfriend, so the first time I've ever had to break up with anyone. And I'm like, wow, that went really well. The next day she called me and said, so are we going to go out tonight? I went, but I broke up with you yesterday. And she goes, yesterday was April 1st. That was an April Fool's joke, wasn't it?
Oh, dear.
Yeah. And I'm like, oh, no wonder. She kept laughing and saying, good one during the breakup. This is all making sense now. So I talk about that in the show. And another comedian I saw the other week, Ben Rubin, really funny guy, a local comedian. And he works FIFO, so he doesn't get to do a lot of stand-up. But he's a super funny dude. He had a similar joke where he talked about when not to break up with girls. He was saying you can't do it before Valentine's Day. Obviously can't do it April Fool's Day. Can't do it. And he went through and I'm like, And so I've kind of spoken to him backstage and I said, I've got the exact... Like, it's not the same joke, but it happened to me and I told the story of it. And he was like, so do you want me to stop doing it? And I'm like, no, I'm not that much of a dick. But I'm just letting you know that I will... That's part of my show. I've tried it out already. I've done it on stage. I'm not saying you've seen me do it, because clearly yours is a different bit.
Sure.
Just similar punchline. So there's moments like that where it's different enough that it doesn't matter, but because it's part of this big show I'm writing, I couldn't just drop, the whole show revolving around my ex-girlfriends. I guess I just won't tell the story of how I broke up with my first girlfriend.
It's just part of the narrative. You can't really have this big chunk missing.
So, but in other instances, there's been jokes that I've just had to drop altogether. And there's been comedians I see that the joke's so similar that I think you can't have come up with that there'll be... I saw someone the other night, and I won't mention names, but they did word for word a joke from Greg Giraldo's Comedy Central Presents special. And I'm a big fan of Greg Giraldo, so I'm like, that's not even disguised. That's almost word for word the same. But they got a big laugh, so I guess they're going to keep doing it. But it's one of those things that if I knew the person better, I'd probably call them out on it, or probably sit down with them and go, you realise that that's not your joke, right?
Are there guys in the scene who have been around for a long time, they're established and they'll drop the hammer if they see that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember doing a gig with Wurzel once, and, Wurzel, he did ring announcing for EPW for a while.
Yep.
Wurzel, they called the King of Perth Comedy, and we were doing a gig at the Comedy Lounge, and I was up second. The guy who was up first got up and did a 10-minute routine that was a Rowan Atkinson routine. But it wasn't like, I'm not very famous. It was a really famous, like every person in the crowd is looking at each other going, is he fucking serious right now? That's clearly a Rowan Atkinson routine from one of his most famous specials. And this guy was doing, it's the one where he dresses up as the devil. And so this guy came out and did word for word. And Wurzel was looking at me backstage going, this isn't happening, right? This is literally, he is quoting word for word. And so when Wurzel went out, when he finished up to introduce me, he goes, let's hear it for, and I don't even remember the guy's name, he goes, let's hear it for that guy. Or should I say, let's hear it for Rowan Atkinson, who that man just killed and raped on this stage in front of you all.
Yep.
And so he didn't just call the guy out on it, he called him out in front of everyone. And so people will drop the hammer if they have to.
Yep.
Yeah.
Coming from wrestling, obviously, but not from a comedy background. But when you see things and you've been around long enough, I think you feel partly responsible, like you're almost a gatekeeper for good wrestling or good comedy or whatever it is. And being part of a fringe art form, which I would consider comedy and wrestling both to be fringe art forms, I suppose you want to go to the defence of your art form and you want to go to the defence of your fellow artists.
There's that fear that everyone in this audience is going to walk out of here and go, well, if this is the first show they've been to in Perth, they're going to go, oh, so they just quote famous comedians' jokes? That's all they do here? So if you don't come to that defence, that's your fear, is they're going to leave with that impression that all Perth comedy is terrible. And so you have to separate, oh, no, that guy who was ripping off Rowan Atkinson, he's not one of us. He's dead to us. This is what we do. And then, so it's kind of, if you don't call it out, it can get confused for what's actually happening on the scene.
Yeah, sure. And you mentioned that you're doing the Fringe this upcoming year?
Yeah, so it'll be January and February 2015. So Yeah, it's been a long process that started. Last year I went to the Perth Fringe World and I saw my friend Nellie White, super funny comedian who I used to do a duo act with. We were called News to Us, which was like a live version of Weekend Update. And I went to see her show and it was really, really good, and talked to her afterwards, and it's the first comedy show I've been to in a long time. And she was saying, well, why aren't you doing it anymore? And I'm like, I've got kids. I'm too old. And she's like, you've got to do this again. And so she stroked my ego just enough that I decided I've got to do this. That's my goal, is next year I'm going to do a show in this festival. And so I started writing back in March of 2014, ready for the January deadline, I guess, for the 2015. So it's been, 9 months at the moment working on this show and putting it together. And yeah, I'm really happy with how it's coming along, that it's all, as I said, that theme of it's dealing with my previous relationships. So the show's called Luke Bolland Dodged a Bullet, and it's really funny. Like, it's all the stories in it are true. I wanted it to be as real as possible, so it's not just, hey, I dated all these supermodels. Like, it's stuff that actually happened. I was incredibly awkward with women, and I talk about that and talk about all the real experiences that happened to me leading up to meeting my wife and getting married. And so it's different to what I've done before. What I normally will try and do on stage is drop as many jokes as I can. I want to get as many laughs.
A lot of one-liners.
Yeah. So this is stepping kind of away from that a little and more into a storytelling that it's still got a lot of really funny moments in, but there's also some touching moments, I hope, in there that I hope people will actually watch it and go, oh, well, that was actually a really nice show, and it'll affect them in parts, not just be like, I like where he made that dick joke, although there will be some dick jokes in there, so don't worry if that's why you're coming along.
It must be pretty daunting to move from comedy, which is quite punchy, to, like you say, more of a narrative, more of a story, and you're telling your own life story as well.
Yeah, because there is that comfort of when I'm on stage, if I'm dropping lots of one-liners, I know that if that didn't make you laugh, there's another punchline coming in 10 seconds, and that probably will. And so there's that comfort in, if something doesn't work, something else is coming that probably will. And so this is more of, if you don't like this story, I'm sorry, because it goes for 5 minutes. So that's why it's, all the stories are interesting though, they're compelling, so it's not like, because there's not a punchline every 20 seconds, you're going to be sitting there going, oh, just tell us another joke. It's interesting enough that I hope it'll keep people's attention and they'll enjoy the whole show. And like I said, they put so much work into it, I'd be surprised if it doesn't go well at this point. Sure.
And you mentioned before that it can be tough motivating yourself to get out there after a long day of family and work. Is comedy still a release for you, or does it feel like work sometimes?
It's a bit of both. It's one of those things that most people who do comedy will find, especially in Perth, that the unpaid gigs outnumber the paid gigs. And for me, it's a big thing because, like I said, that big fear of I get on stage, I start telling jokes, and there's someone in the audience who saw me last month, so they've seen the jokes I did last month. So I constantly try and keep it fresh. In order to do that, I can't get a paid gig and get up and try out new jokes that may suck. Yeah. I have to get up in front of an audience and try out new material and make sure it's good. And so I have to take a lot of unpaid gigs just to get that stage time to try out jokes, and then when I get the paid gigs, all right, I've got 30 minutes of great jokes that I know will work for this. How long do you need me to do?
Yep.
And so this year I started doing stand-up again in February after, almost a 4-year hiatus. And it would be about, I'd say 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 paid gigs to unpaid gigs, with the unpaid being the vast majority.
Yeah, sure.
But it's not something that if you're doing comedy, you can't be doing it for money. If you're doing it for money, you're never going to kind of make it. You need to do it because you have something deep down inside of you that's messed up, and you need validation from the audience in order to continue to function as a human being.
That's funny. It's actually one of the topics that I'll continue to look into podcast after podcast is throughout my travels, I've dealt with lots of different people in fringe art forms, and I've found that there is that similar longing for attention that seems to be a recurring theme right across it. It doesn't matter what your chosen art form is. People that are drawn towards fringe art forms seem to have that something that's lacking where they need that attention to help validate themselves. And it's interesting seeing people come from different backgrounds, and your family is one of the closest family units I've ever met. It definitely wouldn't be you growing up with a lack of love or anything like that, but what is it that drives us to have to do this to try and fill that hole? That's one of the things I'm trying to explore.
I think being shit at sports. I think that's pretty much it.
I was pretty good at sports.
Then I don't know what your issue is. I can't help you there. Mine is pretty much... I wasn't athletic. That's the only reason I do stand-up. Jeez. It's not really. That's a lie. It's just... It's not even so much the need to be validated and to please an audience so much, but it's kind of... There's that desire in myself to know that I can do it. And I am, without a doubt, my own harshest critic. That I'll walk off a stage, and I've had nights where I'll walk off and I am so angry. Like, I wasted a night. I've driven out here, I've waited an hour and a half backstage to walk on only to suck, and I can't believe how terrible that went. And now what I've started doing is recording when I'm on stage. I'll set my phone to voice record, walk off stage, and I can listen back to it. And I'll generally play it for my wife when I get home. And I remember a few weeks back just having a set that I hated. And a friend of ours, Nate, was in the audience. And I didn't want him to come along because I was trying out a brand new bit. And it didn't go well. And then I'm angry, like, why did he have to come along tonight? He could have come along. I'm doing a show Friday, and that's all stuff that kills, and it would have been so much. And he had to come and see me when I was doing an average gig, and Greg Fleet was the MC, and he saw, and he's like a hero of mine, and now he thinks I'm a terrible comedian. And so I'm really, like, all these thoughts in my head, and I storm out of there. I don't hang around to say hi to anyone. I just leave and jump in my car and drive home angry and listen back to it. And it was consistent laughs from start to finish. And I was like, what a great set. And I'm like, yeah, it was much better than it sounded in my head when I walked off the stage. That's the one good thing I'm doing now is recording and listening back, because if it's not killing the whole way through, my brain just goes, well, that sucked. So finding that healthy headspace is tough sometimes. I think there's something that sometimes it's less about the reaction and more about the manipulation. I'm not speaking for you, obviously, but I know for me as a wrestler, being in front of a crowd, I've had crowds where the noise in the audience is consistently high, but they're not ebbing and flowing the way that I want them to. So I would come backstage and everybody's giving me a pat on the back, and I feel horrible about how it went because I didn't have the manipulation that I was hoping to have. That, to me, that's the skill, being able to actually control the way people are feeling during what is essentially my set. But to go out there sometimes where the audience there's just a murmur for most of the match, and then they sort of come up a little bit at the end, but I feel like I did my job more efficiently because they moved the way I wanted them to. Yeah, it's an interesting way to look at it, because I have gigs exactly like that, but it'll have a strong start and a strong finish, and that's what you really want. But if it's not that continuous, that's just not good enough for me. Like, it should be. I had people afterwards coming up going, man, really enjoyed. And the thing with stand-up that it took me a while to learn is they don't have to be laughing at every single thing. Because I know when I go watch comedy, I very rarely laugh out loud. I love comedians I thoroughly enjoy, and I could watch all day long, and they'll maybe make me laugh twice out loud in their hour set. But I've loved every second of it. Yep. Yet in my mind, when I walk off the stage, I can't get that thought myself. They weren't laughing the whole time. What's wrong with my set? That it can't be that thought of maybe they were just enjoying it, but it wasn't laugh out loud for them. Maybe they're not the sort of people that do laugh out loud easily, but they still enjoyed. And so there's a lot of thoughts that go through your head. It can be a really harsh beast stand-up comedy to deal with. But yeah, it's I'm getting better at it, at not just stand-up, but at dealing with each gig and just able to put it all in perspective. And I think coming back to the having kids now certainly helps with that. That previously, before kids, when I had a bad set, that would be enough to put me, ruin my week. Whereas now, it might ruin my evening. Next morning, it's not a big deal anymore. Your kids are waking up and, they'll deal with that later.
They don't care about how the set went last night.
No, and it's really tough to tell them when, I'm putting my daughter's almost 4 and put her to bed, and she knows when I'm going to work because, I'm having to get ready as I'm getting her ready for bed. And so she'll be like, "You're going to work?" It's like, "Yeah." "Where are you going?" "Daddy's going to go make drunk people laugh. That's what Daddy's doing tonight." That's a weird thing to tell your kids, that it's hard for them to comprehend. And I've showed them footage, and it kind of means nothing to them. The only one they were impressed with was when I did the ice hockey at Perth Arena.
Sure.
Because there was fireworks at the end of my set that they went off, and they're like, "Play that again." And I'm like, "Sure." And I take it back to the beginning. Here's Daddy doing jokes in front of 14,000 people. No. Take us to the fireworks, Dad. That's all we care about. We don't care about your little Justin Bieber joke you did there. Let's get to the fireworks.
Just minimising your work again.
Yeah.
Good on them.
Kids. Who'd have them?
Anything to promote? Where can people find you?
LukeBolland.com is my website. At Lukey20 on Twitter. I got a Facebook, Luke Bolland Comedian. I guess the main thing that, it'd be great if people came along to, though, was this Fringe World show I've been working so hard on. Luke Bolland, Luke Bolland dodged a bullet. Tickets will be on sale through the Perth Fringe World website to the end of January, beginning of February, and it's going to be a really great show. So that's the one I'm hoping that people come out to.
Awesome. Thanks for your time, Luke.
Thanks for having me.
And that was my chat with Lukey Bolland. As he mentioned, Luke will be appearing at Perth Fringe World this upcoming January and February. Make sure you head on down and check him out. If you'd like to suggest a guest for the podcast or just drop us a line, you can hit us up on Twitter at OnTheFringePod or find us on Facebook at On The Fringe Podcast. The guest for the next episode will be Melbourne-based professional wrestler Gino Gambino, also known as Mr. Juicy. This was an incredibly interesting chat. Should be up in the next 2 weeks, so make sure you check back. So until next time, my name's Dave Farley, and you've been listening to On The Fringe.
Are you going to do your own Mark Maron intro?
Yeah, I think so.
Keep it shorter. It's the worst part of his show.